I've called this Shavuot 2022 Prepared to Receive. I think this is the key focus, the key focal point that I want to focus on. And we're gonna do two things this evening. We're gonna, number one, kind of look at the transition from out of Egypt to approaching Mount Sinai, and then a more perfect fulfillment of the Torah being given to the congregation at Shavuot, which is on the one where the Holy Spirit came in Acts chapter 2. So we're gonna walk through that just briefly, and then you know that it is tradition to read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, and it's a short book. We're actually going to read that together this evening, but first we're going to lay a little bit of groundwork, because as we're reading the book of Ruth, we're going to look at a couple of key ideas in the book of Ruth and just kind of elaborate on those and tie them back to what we've just been talking about. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to start by saying, you know that we were transferred out of the kingdom of the adversary when we left Egypt. I think that is a perfect metaphor, just a beautiful prophetic picture of being transferred out of the kingdom of the adversary and into the kingdom of Messiah Yeshua. As he brings us out of Egypt, he takes, our blood on the door now is Yeshua's blood that takes us out of Egypt, and we're passed over from from death into life, and we are now starting fresh, and we have been transferred out of the evil kingdom and are now a part of the majestic kingdom of the Father and his Son. But now we find ourselves during this period of Shavuot, this 50-day period, as we leave Egypt and we approach the mountain to hear what the Father has to say to us, as he wants to say, "You are now my servants. I have some instructions for you because you have left Pharaoh's household and you are now becoming a part of my household. My household has rules just like Pharaoh's household. However, my yoke is easy and my burden is light," right? As exactly Yeshua would say. This is what the Father is telling these former slaves who are being transferred. We have rules in this kingdom too. They're just a heck of a lot easier to deal with. But you know, if you've studied the Torah for any length of time, that you have that period of 50 days. And if you, in your mind, sitting right here today, just recollecting about how would you characterize that 50-day period as the Israelites traveled from Egypt to Mount Sinai? How would you characterize that 50-day period? Was it one of fraught with difficulty? Why? Why would you say it was fraught with difficulty? The Israelites were kind of belligerent, yes, stiff-necked. They were still full of Egypt. They got taken out of Egypt, but Egypt was still in them, very much so. They grumbled and they complained a lot whenever something happened that they didn't like. We've talked about that. I mean, over this last 50 days, I mean, I have talked to you guys repeatedly about, trying not to complain, because complaining was something the children of Israel did during that 50 days, and we really wanted to try. Let me ask you a question. By a show of hands, if you like, has anyone felt like you are learning to be humbled during this last 50 days? I know I have. This has been, I can tell you honestly that the Spirit of God has really put his thumb on me in these last 50 days and has, in no uncertain terms, told me, humble yourself. I want for you to humble yourself willingly, because if you don't, you're going to be humbled. I don't know what's going on out there in the world. It's certainly very strange. But I can just sense that we need to be prepared to hear from God. This is what the whole thing is, being prepared to receive. So As we've been making our way to the mountain, so to speak, for the last 50 days, counting the Omer, we've tried to stop complaining. We have tried to learn to trust in Yuvah more completely, especially when facing difficulties. We've tried to cleanse our minds of leaven. I know that was a big... Not only did we do that leaven cleansing, this doctrines of men and confusing Babylonian mixed weird religious ideas that kind of trip us up and give us preconceived ideas about what the word actually says when it doesn't. There's so many difficulties when you have that mixed leaven in your mind. So we've tried to cleanse our minds of leaven, not just on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but just continuing as we approach that mountain. And trying to humbly prepare to receive his words. So that's been the journey that I feel like I have been on, and I know from talking with some of you over the last couple of months that this is the journey that you're on too, of purifying your hearts, humbling yourself, being willing to hear from the Father, those kinds of things. And so now we are, in a manner of speaking, standing at the foot of that mountain one more time, right now. I know. Does it feel like that for you? I know it does for me. And this is something that I want to ask you to consider. Do you believe that perhaps this very evening, I mean, it's going to be 9 a.m. in Jerusalem when? Probably at 10 o'clock tonight. This is when things happen, right? In the morning of the third day, at the morning oblation, when they gather in the temple. And we're going to read, at the third hour. Yeah, absolutely. So that hour is coming up. Do you actually expect to hear from God? Maybe you should. I don't know if that's something that you've thought of, but I can tell you this. Do you think that it was a tremendous transition from receiving the Torah at Sinai to receiving the Torah made flesh, to receiving the Torah implanted in your heart by the Spirit on Pentecost, Shavuot? Do you think that there's an even greater fulfillment, another one, where there's I don't want to say a greater revelation, but a more broad, perhaps? I mean, when you look at the Acts chapter 2 passage that talks about, that's quoting from the book of Joel, was all of that fulfilled in Acts chapter 2? It was not. And we're going to read that in just a second. So this is kind of the whole point that I would like to make this evening as we discuss some of these things is there's still a revelation. And I guess my point to you would be, do you want to hear from God yourself? Or do you want to hear about it on the internet? Because if you're not prepared, if you have not prepared your garments, if you have not cleansed yourself in the blood of Messiah and the pure washing of the Word, if you have not humbled yourself and pulled out the leaven, you're not capable of hearing God. Now, am I saying that there's going to be a voice from heaven speaking to you? Not necessarily. But I do believe that there is a day coming when God will speak again to his people. I would love to be in a position where I'm able to receive that. But I know that for most of my life, and perhaps even now, I'm not. I'm not worthy. I'm not a worthy vessel to receive that. I don't believe so. So that's something I want to emphasize for myself especially. First thing I want to do is I want to look at with you Exodus 19. If you wouldn't mind, open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 19. I've got it up on the screen here. I'm reading a modified version of the New American Standard, which I modified myself. Thank you very much. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but I have discovered the secret of going into electronic Bible software and getting into the code underneath the hood and changing anything I want. It's a horrible, horrible power to have. But,
They changed your name, you changed it back.
That's exactly what I did. I changed the name back to the original. And when it says church, I put in congregation or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Kahal, or make it easier to read. But I want to read with you this section from Exodus chapter 19, just verses 10 through 17. This is specifically regarding what happened at Shavuot. Exodus 19, starting in verse 10, if you don't mind. It says this: You have also said to Moshe, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and have them wash their garments, and have them ready for the third day. For on the third day, Yehovah will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. But you shall set boundaries for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall certainly be stoned or shot through. Whether animal or person shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moshe went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. He also said to the people, be ready for the third day, do not go near a woman. So it came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet Elohim, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now, this is when we first get to meet Elohim at the foot of the mountain. Now, a couple of interesting things. Number one, prepare for the third day. Moses, the mediator, consecrated them. We know now that Yeshua is the new mediator. There's only been two mediators of this covenant. If you'll remember when we studied the book of Acts, that was a big thing that we looked into, is this role of a mediator is a different thing than a prophet or a teacher. It's a real close, intimate relationship that's directly between the Father and the people. It's higher than a priest, even. I believe that the text shows that. So we've got Moshe as the mediator, consecrating the people. It doesn't say specifically how Moshe consecrated the people, but now we definitely believe that Yeshua is our mediator of this better covenant that we are living under now, this renewed covenant. In what way would you say that the Messiah Yeshua consecrates his people? What is consecration even? I mean, how would you define that? I think cleansing is a great synonym for consecrating. Where did we lose Hayden? Oh, okay. Did he give someone the microphone?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Brett. Gracie, just hand it to Tracy, and she can hand it down the line over to Gracie. Thank you. Go ahead, Gracie.
Giving it. I don't know the word. I lost
Consecrating,
the word.
sorry.
Yeah. Consecrating is presenting it to the Lord as his, for him to cleanse it.
Okay.
And whether he gives it back to you or not is up to him.
Okay. Excellent. Would you hand that to Mike? Mike, would you just hold on to that? You're kind of the central figure here. We'll kind of pass it around. Yeah, I think that's a good. Anyone else? Anyone online or in person here want to? So, Tracy, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on the washing the robes. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Consecrating.
Oh, well, that's another part of it. But if you want to talk about that, yeah, bring it up.
Just in Ephesians 5 is when he talks about husbands loving their wives, and just as Messiah loved us by washing us in the water of the Word.
Yeah.
And I was just talking about this today with Mike. It's just, I feel like he's the one that cleansed our garments. He made us clean. He gave us white robes, but we have the opportunity to defile those garments. So if we keep them clean by abiding in him and abiding in the Word, I just think that there's a connection here. And I know that Revelation 22:14 talks about blessed are those who do the commandments, that they have a right to the tree of life, but other translations say blessed are those who wash their robes. So there could be a connection there.
Yeah,
too,
I have actually here
here
in my notes 3 different sections from Revelation regarding garments. So yeah, that's a key passage that I think kind of ties those two ideas together of purifying and cleansing the garments, cleansing the heart, cleansing the mind. I think that all of these things are, and I think what Gracie said is also really pertinent where, if you kind of think of a priest waving loaves, for example, on Shavuot, presenting the grain offering to the Lord. So that's certainly something that might fit in that same category. But you notice that these are the ways that we are supposed to sanctify, purify ourselves in order to approach God, in order to hear from him on Shavuot. Notice that Moses also says, do not go near a woman. Is sex bad? Does it make you unclean in some way? Yes, in a sense. There is a certain uncleanness that comes from that. That there needs to be a washing, a ceremonial washing in some cases. But it's also, I think more importantly, the idea that perhaps sexual relations had been corrupted in Egypt. And that, maybe this is a precaution. Like, hey, you guys don't exactly know what purity in sexual relations are. So we might want to just abstain from that for 3 days, as we approach the mountain. But that's a little bit more complex than I wanted to get into this evening. But these are just ways that I want you to consider as you dig into, what does it mean to be sanctified in order to hear from God? These are some of the key things. Having the appropriate mediator, having your garments cleansed, keeping yourself pure from sexual sins and idolatry. You see, and that this is tying right back to Acts chapter 15 as well. So, Angela, anything from you?
No.
Okay. And now,
Were you going to move away from this?
I was going to move away from this one just because I can tell I could go on for too long here, and I want to get to the book of Ruth.
Well, I guess before we go to Ruth, I would pick out
Sure.
a couple things about this to keep in mind. They're standing at the foot of the mountain because she's going to be at someone's feet. The washed garments, because she's going to wash her garments. And
Yes.
this idea of this being a betrothal and that there was a cloud over the mountain, like the pupa
Mm-hmm.
over the. So that whole idea of a marriage between, or a betrothal between a man and wife, because that's kind of what we're going to be reading in Ruth, and that idea that that's not about this part. Never mind. Go.
Okay. No, that's okay. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and we're kind of picking up on some ideas. Go ahead, Lori. Yes, Mike, would you hand that to Lori for me?
Well, it's bringing to mind the ancient Jewish wedding feast, how when the bridegroom would go to the to-be bride, they'd make their covenant, and then he'd go away for a year. It was the time of separation.
Right.
And I'm wondering if this idea of not going near a woman was about separating yourself, because when the farther you get away from that type of activity, your mind stops thinking about it.
Right.
You empty yourself out so you can receive something, so your mind's not distracted with it.
Well, and I think Paul mentions that too in abstaining for a time by agreement, so that you might devote yourselves to prayer or fasting or something like that. So yeah, there's a certain amount of ridding yourself of the desires of the flesh in order to clarify the desires of the spirit. I think that's a good reflection. But I just want to just bring those things up, because these things that are happening at the foot of the mountain are really about preparing to hear from God, and I think that's such a key thing that we need to be focused on. I want to take you to the next passage, which is just this little section from the book of Acts, where we'll kind of see some parallel ideas. This is Acts chapter 2, starting right at verse 1. I'm going to read that for you. It says, when the day of Pentecost / Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly a noise like a violent rushing wind came from heaven, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And tongues like fire appeared to them, distributing themselves and resting on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with different tongues, as the Spirit was giving them to speak. Now there were Jews residing in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the crowd came together, and they were bewildered, because each one of them was hearing them speak in his own language. So just to point out a couple of interesting things about this little passage here. Number one, it says that the devout were all gathered in one place. If you have a translation that's an accurate translation, it should clear up some of the confusion here for you, because if you've studied the Greek and looking, tying this back, you know that verse 1 there has all kinds of problems. Because number one, it says when the day of Pentecost had, there's literally in the Greek translation, it says something to the effect of having fully manifested. And that is a very different translation than when the day had come. It's very different, because this when the day had come, look at that in your Greek, if you've got an Apostles Bible polyglot, it gives you the strict Greek rendering. And that basically tells you that when the Feast of Shavuot had come around and was coming around in a big and full way, it literally seems to suggest in the Greek that when the fulfillment of Shavuot had come. That's why some translations will say when the day of Pentecost had fully arrived. You may have a translation that says had fully arrived, because it really is saying when the day of Shavuot had become fulfilled. This is a greater fulfillment of Shavuot, when the Spirit of God is coming about and is implanting himself in the hearts of the disciples. Okay, it's just like receiving the Torah from Sinai, but only much better, with power, by the Spirit, in the flesh, in your heart, not on stone tablets. So, that's the interesting thing. And it says they were gathered together in one place. Again, the Greek doesn't say that. It says they were gathered together in one. In one. The word place isn't even in the text. What is the one place?
Unity.
They were gathered together in unity. And where were they at? In the house?
Temple.
The house of God. The house of the Father. They were at the temple. Okay, there were not 120 people sitting in a little hut in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, no. They're in the temple at the hour of prayer, most likely, when this phenomenon struck. Bless you.
Oh, yeah,
Who's got the mic? Mike, give the mic. Sorry.
And yeah, I know the mainstream Christianity wants to say, yeah, they were up in the townhouse, and they all of a sudden the flames of fire, the tongues of fire came through the ceiling or whatever, and then it was so loud that all the Jews in the city heard it. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't really match the text, because all these people were able to hear the tongues spoken right there on the Temple Mount, and that's where all the Jews were.
Right.
So,
Like any observant Jew in that day, they would have been in the temple.
and the 3,000, if extending, we know that 3,000 were converted. They didn't do that up in the townhouse, because they wouldn't have saw the wonder that happened. So,
and I know that you guys have probably already noted too that whereas 3,000 died immediately after receiving the commandments because of the sin of the golden calf, that it's kind of like a redemption, a swap. 3,000 were rescued from the kingdom of the adversary at the same day. What was it, 1,500 years later or so? So yeah, it's fascinating. Now, and I wanted to just bring up to you a couple of things. All of these devout men were gathered in one place in unity, where the Father told them to be. Just like you are right now. You devout men and women who are where the Father told you to be, in fellowship with one another. You're positioned, I'm just saying, you're positioned to hear from God. And is this the time when there's another outpouring? Don't know. We'll see. So the Spirit comes upon these believers. The Torah is in their heart now. And Peter, by the Spirit, states his case, quoting the book of Joel. When they get some hecklers in the peanut gallery saying, hey, these people are drunk. No, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. If you're drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're a professional. Some of,
Drunk and starts speaking language, that's a talent.
Hook me up with some of that drink. No, but here's a direct quote from Joel chapter 2, starting in verse 28. I will read this for you. This is what Peter quotes to them to say, no. this is the fulfillment of the prophecy. He says, it will come about after this that I will pour out my spirit on all mankind. Did all mankind have the Spirit poured out on them here in Pentecost? No, this is a pretty select group of Jews. Apparently, 120 of them, if you take, the strict tradition. Does that mean that the Spirit is going to be poured out on every member of the human race, or does that mean a broad spectrum of people from all over the planet? Both. Probably both. Okay? So maybe the next fulfillment is a broad spectrum of believers from all over the planet. The Holy Spirit comes upon them and they begin to do similar kind of things. And then maybe later in the future, the Spirit of God covers the whole place like the waters cover the sea in the king. Speak it up.
I said maybe it's 144,000.
It could be 144,000. Who is going to talk?
It's just believing mankind. I mean, you say
Believing
all
mankind.
but
Yes,
it's
all
just
believing mankind. That's probably a good way to put it. Gracie?
Prepared.
Yes.
People that are
Prepared.
prepared.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'll continue reading. And go,
There you go,
Tracy.
Tracy.
Go, Tracy. Go, Tracy. Go.
I may have a different
Oh, no, you
understanding.
don't.
It's just that when he says I'm going to pour out my spirit on all flesh, I think it's that fire analogy where it's like you can either dwell with the consuming fire or you cannot.
Mm.
And so I think especially in the day of the Lord when that spirit is poured out on all flesh, some will be refined by it and some will be consumed by it.
I like your idea. That's a good one. Very nice. So, your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your old men will have dreams, your young men will see visions, and even on the male and female servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of YHVH comes. And it will come about that everyone who calls on the name of YHVH will be rescued, will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, just as YHVH has said, even among the survivors whom YHVH calls. So we're dealing here with what seems to be, to my mind, a much broader application of the Spirit of God than what we saw in Pentecost. So I'm fairly confident that, could happen again. But there you go. That's my preamble to the study, the reading of the book of Ruth, where we can kind of take a look at, you're going to see some of those themes in the book of Ruth as we go through. And what I want to do is I've got the entire book of Ruth on these slides, and you can take a look at them as we go. Pretty short, like I said. We're going to read it together. And Angela actually has placed some of the text in bolded pieces, so because we might want to just say something about it. And please feel free. We're going to read it and stop and say a word here and there. And I encourage you to do the same if you want to. Angela?
I think a lot of the time when I bolded something, it was because this book has been coming up so much as in the last 6 months, I would say. And they were just things that related to things we had discussed previously. Not that we needed to go back. If you remember, they're just bold, and maybe there's something you remember that you've heard already. But we're not going to rehash all of that stuff. Before you started it, I wanted to
Please
point out that the timing of this book is, you'll see that it gives the time of year that this is happening, and it's during, the main part of the story is happening during that 50-day count. We're just now finishing. So I heard a teacher say something that really stuck with me. She said, Passover and unleavened bread are not sealed.
Aiden.
Passover and unleavened bread are not sealed up until you finish the counting. Because remember, the counting of the Omer starts at first fruits, which is embedded in the week of unleavened bread, which is that Passover season. And so it's like these first 4 are linked and tied together. And
go ahead if you have something else, man.
well, we had talked about this Shavuot as being the approach to the throne. And we did that with the letter to Pergamum, that the way to approach it is to be humble and holy, to not be profaned and to not be proud. And when I was thinking about that, it's the ones who are not profaned that are most tempted to succumb to pride. And then it's those who are profaned that are the softest towards feeling humbled. And so it's like this dichotomy of these two things we're supposed to be when we approach the throne that are really hard to be at the same time together. and that reminded me of a marriage, that you've got the man and the woman, and it's really hard to be together. For not, I'm not, just in general, there's problems that he talked about that at the beginning of the Genesis. And so that there's this learning that happens when you put these two things that are tension, like God, fire and water, but there's this balance between those two tension opposite things, and that this book is about marriage. And so when you think about that learning that happens when you're trying to balance each other, because I know that in our own marriage, that shift, when it shifts too far one way, there's problems. When it shifts too far the other way, that creates other problems. So there's this constant maintaining the correct amount of tension between us two when we're trying to be one. And it's not something that you finally figure out how to do one day and it's all done and now we're all good. It's something you have to maintain all the time. So
Absolutely. Anybody else have anything to say about that? Okay. So I'm going to look at reading this now. Would you like to read? Okay, here we go.
we can trade off.
Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the fields of Moab with his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, my Elohim is king, and the name of his wife, Naomi, my delight, and the names of his 2 sons were Machlon, which means sick, and Chilion, which means failing. They were Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now, what's that? Aren't you delighted that I didn't name you Machlon? Now they entered the fields of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, which means gazelle, or could mean stiff-necked, and the name of the other was Ruth, also called Ruth in English, which means friendship. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Machlon and Chilion also died, and the woman, that is Naomi, was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the fields of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab, for Yehovah had visited his people in giving them bread. Did you want to briefly?
Yeah, because first of all, she's coming from the fields of Moab, so she's coming from the east over probably the same way that Joshua entered the land with the people over the top of the Dead Sea there by Jericho. Moab's on the other side there. So she's coming from the other side. She's crossing over that river into the land with Naomi, where Ruth and Naomi are both doing that. But that those words that arose, which is your resurrection language, return, and she heard. So she arose that she might return from out there, outside the land, for she had heard, and she heard it when she was out of Moab, which is kind of the situation.
Very nice. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law, that is Chalah, brides, were with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 brides, "Go, Return, each of you, to her mother's house. May Yehovah deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May Yehovah grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, but they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said, I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of Yehovah has gone forth against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother, but Ruth cleaved or clung to her.
So right there, notice that there's two brides. That word for daughter-in-law is actually Kala, bride. That term is in this 7 times. And that one of the brides turns back, one of them goes. And so if you then kind of consider the parable of the virgins, the 10 virgins, it's half of them that go in and half of them that don't. And the thing with Naomi telling them to return 3 times, I said, do you remember what we had heard about Judaism?
Yeah, when a Gentile wants to convert to Judaism, they say, I'd like to convert, and they're like, no, you don't. Like, no, I'm serious. I really want to convert. No, you don't. They tell them 3 times, no, you don't. I think they actually get that, as far as my understanding is, because according to Judaism, Ruth is like the epitome of a convert. It's like the ideal convert. So they try to turn her away. Say no. And I think I have said before, I think I said this before when we were studying the book of Acts and talking about evangelism, that it might not be a bad idea to go back that route. People, I think, were a little upset with me because I was like, I think we have gotten a little too sloppy with our grace in recent generations, where it's like, oh, just come as you are and Jesus will love you and you'll go to heaven and everything will be great. There's no obligations to just come as you are and you'll be fine. I think we really need to perhaps start telling people the truth. It's like, hey, when you sign up to belong to this family, there are some serious obligations here. This is not all fun and games here. This is some serious business. So I think that's an interesting takeaway. I'm going to continue then. It says, Then she said, Behold, your sister has gone back to her people and to her Elohims, her gods. Return after your sister. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you, or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your Elohim my Elohim. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may Yehovah do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. That is some fierce determination. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came about when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred up because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? And she said to them, Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, bitterness. For El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but Yehovah has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since Yehovah has witnessed against me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her bride, who returned from the fields of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So here we're talking about the beginning of the barley harvest is the beginning of the counting of the Omer, right?
So are you guys picking up on this? And while he's reading it, kind of the Ruth being the bride, you're picking up and following that subtext, right? It's not a story about Ruth. It's a story about bride.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes it's hard for me to switch. If the story gets interesting, I flip out of it.
Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, flowing streams or branches, after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she departed and went and leaned in the field after the reapers. Gleaned, excuse me, Angela mistyped that. After the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now, I was going to just pause briefly and point out that you notice when if you read Deuteronomy 23, because it's, Shavuot, I don't know if you guys do, but every time there's a holy day that is approaching, I always return right back to Leviticus 23 to read about the holy day. And you notice something strange that pops out at you? There's an addendum, kind of, right immediately after you get the instructions for Shavuot. What does it say? Do not glean to the corners of your field. Isn't that just odd? That is just stuck right in the middle of this discussion of the feast days, that it just gives you some instructions regarding not reaping all the way to the corners of your field. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I've heard it said that that time there, that's Shavuot. That's the first feast till we get 1,000. All feasts till time cleaning.
Yeah, excellent.
And when he's consider this, I don't. This is just something that occurred to me just in the last couple of days, that we're waiting for the fulfillment of the fall feast, right? Okay. What if they kick off on Shavuot?
What do you mean by that?
When
You're saying when we're waiting for the fall feasts to kick off.
like this,
What if that begins at
like
Shavuot?
his Joel chapter 2 that he said had been quick. What if we kick off with something like that on Shavuot, and there is that fuller fulfillment of the Spirit, and then that's when those fall all in the same year. So instead of saying Shavuot, that's all been fulfilled, we go that they're still integral, but we've seen the fulfillment with Messiah of Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and then the Spirit on Shavuot. What if the fall, we start at the middle, Shavuot, and then trumpets?
That's certainly
Just
possible, yeah.
consider.
Do you believe, sorry, Tracy, do you believe, and you can answer this if you want, do you believe that there's any still fulfillment for Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits, the first Feast of First Fruits? Is there any continuing revelation there, do you think? You don't have to answer that question. I don't
think
know.
they'll
I mean,
continue
most
to
people
be
would say,
integral.
most people would say, no, Yeshua came as the Passover lamb, that part of it's done. But and I'm not saying there's a new Messiah or something, but could there still be some fulfillment to that? I'm not sure. Do you want to address that real quick?
When Yeshua took the cup of joy, he said, I will not drink this again until it's new in my Father's kingdom.
Yeah. So that's certainly possible. That go ahead, Keith, if you want to answer that, I give it back to Tracy. She wants to make her point. He's hoarding the microphone. You're gonna have to wrestle Keith for
I
it.
was thinking you're asking about maybe some future fulfillment. I think, yes, all the feasts will be pertinent during tribulation, and there's going to be a lot of things happening. And I think if you are appointment-keeping Sabbath believer and you are, assembling during tribulation on these days, that you may see some things that otherwise may not have been noticed to the mainstream believers because they're not familiar with these feasts.
I think that's a good way to look at it, Keith, is not necessarily that there's yet more fulfillment to happen around Passover, but that there's interesting things that might happen on Passover as part of a prophetic
and we might
fulfillment.
click in our mind, Revelation said this, and look, it's
Yeah.
fulfilling on a feast day or
Sure.
something like that.
Yeah, that makes
And then I just wanted to throw in, so as we go across, and I like what Angela said about, could it start up again, and then we would have 4 feasts, just like it was 4 feasts, then it would be, another set of 4. But this idea of the wheat, how when you read Revelation, it says, that was called up to heaven, get your sickle, gather the wheat
There's
into the
2 of
barn.
those, the wheat and then the grape.
Yeah, then the grapes.
Yeah.
And the grapes, well, from what I've seen, and
The
the grape harvest happens 50 days later. It's another 50 count, and that's also based off of some Dead Sea Scroll stuff where
Yeah.
they were looking at keeping a certain harvest festival for the grapes,
Right.
and then they do one for the new oil.
Yeah.
But the idea of that is that the timing is there, that we need to know what they were thinking, being Israel, and how they were looking at the harvests. And many times in Scripture, God mentions about the grain, the new wine, and the oil. The grain, the new wine, and the oil. I
Right.
mean, there's like 30 times that is mentioned. So that timing there could be important coming up someday.
Sure. Okay, Tracy.
I think that's saying the cycles of Yahuwah. Those three feasts, the grain, the new wine, the oil. And then we look at Exodus 12, talks about the night of watches unto Yahuwah. So the menorah being a chiastic structure, they fold on each other. You got the civil and the religious calendar first 7 months.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I don't believe that we know for certain, but each one of them were commanded to guard and keep and show up at.
Yeah.
So that's what we do.
Absolutely. Tracy?
And the feast days are also for us. We're supposed to come and learn about them every year. And each year I learn something new to refine myself.
Yeah.
And what I've been learning too about the call of Yahweh, which he's been calling from the beginning, is he's calling us to the wedding of his son. And the wedding, I think, is a representation of Shavuot, because we can see that with the giving of the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And in Luke 12:36, Messiah is telling us to be watchful and waiting. Well, how do we know to be watchful if we don't know when to be watching? So these are feast days that we're supposed to come together and be watching and waiting. But what's interesting is that he says, you yourselves be like men that wait for their Lord when he shall return from the wedding, that when he comes and knocks, they may open to him immediately. And that sounds like, fall feast, but he's coming from the wedding, which would indicate, I think, Shavuot. So these are all things that are like, on a timeline of some sort.
Nice. Very nice. Excellent.
Before you move on.
Before I move on?
That piece right there, let me go to the. I just wanted to point out where the bride is, when and where she's gleaning. The bride. She's gleaning in the field among and that word for ears of grain is one of those weird words that has different. No, it's a different one. I think it also it's translated in a few ways, and some of the other two ways that I looked at were flowing streams and branches. And so again, we go back to that menorah we've been looking at with its branches, the branches attached to the vine, that middle position, Shavuot, and the flowing streams, because if you look at more of Holissa's work, she's going to make those branches into the rivers of Eden, the flowing waters. And so you have this bride, and she's getting her bread and her water, her flowing streams and her grain in the field of her Redeemer, okay, where she's staying during the time of the 50-day count.
Yeah.
Yes, that was the word.
How do you pronounce it?
No, thank you.
It's a test. It's a trap. Oh, gotta get a
That's
Star
funny.
Wars reference in there. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to continue. Now it says, Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, May Yehovah be with you. And they said to him, May Yehovah bless you. And then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the fields of Moab. And she said, Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves, that is an omer. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Did you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, well, that her kinsman redeemer comes from Bethlehem, that she came in at the start of the barley harvest. She gleans among the omer, that timing, counting of the omer, and that she's in the house for a little while, which we talked about before in relation to that shortening of time.
Yes.
That I've shortened the time. She's there for a little while. And that had to do with the folding of the menorah that he obviously has heard Holyssa talk about, that we talked about at protection from the storm.
That's right.
Was the one we talked about,
That's right. That's
the
right.
timeful.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm gonna continue forward.
Yes.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maidens. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." That's a good one. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And Boaz answered and said to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May Yahweh reward your work, and your wages be full from Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants."
So that whole last section, it probably reminded you guys of when she says, "Why have I found favor in your sight?" That in Matthew, when they say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you in need of clothes? Why have I found favor in your sight?" And then the other piece of that was, of course, how she left her father and her mother in the land of her birth and came to a people that she didn't previously know. And that's language that's very similar to Abraham when he left his family and went to a country that he didn't know. And while Abraham is called a friend of God, Ruth's name means friendship.
Mhm.
So this Ruth and Abraham crossing over, that theme is.
Nice. Okay, moving forward a little bit. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied, and had some left over. Reminds me of the feeding of the 5,000. And when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not shame her. And also you shall purposely pull out for her from the bundles, and leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley.
The amount, the ephah of barley, is the same as 3 seahs. And there's another place in the Bible when there's 3 seahs.
Is that one of the offerings of the priests?
No, it's the amount, well, maybe, I
Oh.
don't know, but it's the
No,
amount that
it's Sarah.
Sarah prepared before the angels came to Abraham before they went to Sodom. And when they came to Abraham, he ran in and he told her, make the bread out of 3 seahs worth. And this story actually, not just that connection between the friend of God and Ruth, friendship, but the kindness to sojourners, I think, is going to be another really heavy theme, Ruth. And so that was Abraham exhibiting kindness to strangers. And then what you see, well, hang on to that thought. Just put it in your pocket for like 10 minutes, and then we'll connect that Sodom and Gomorrah thing to Ruth.
Okay. So next it says, "And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, 'Where did you glean today? And where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed.' So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, 'The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz.' And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, the bride, 'May he be blessed of Yahweh, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead.' And Naomi said to her, 'The man is our relative, Karov. He is our redeemer. He is one of our redeemers, the Gaal.' And then Ruth the Moabitess said, furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, lest others fall upon you in another field. So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? And now, is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. And she said to her, all that you say, I will do.
So there we're back at Exodus 19, where we started, with Israel at the mountain under the cloud, the betrothal where they're washed, and they're at the foot of the mountain. And they say, all that Jehovah has spoken, we will do. So
Interesting connection.
there's other languages there that are used at that betrothal of the mountain that are like bridal speak. He says, I bore you on eagle's wings. I'm going to ask him to cover her with their wings, which is a way of asking him to marry her. I brought you to myself. You are a special treasure to me, kingdom of priests, a holy nation. All this bride talk.
Tracy, are you done? Or
I'm done.
Reminds me of the wedding at Cana when Messiah did his first miracle. Even something that you read before about take this, what that servant's water, drink of the servant's water, something like that. Messiah's mother, which kind of is reminding me here of Naomi a little bit, said, whatever he says to you, do it. And so he tells the servants to go and fill up the water and draw it out. So I'm just thinking there might be a connection there too.
Yeah. Nice. Did you have something else? Okay. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. So spread your covering over your maidservant, for you are a redeemer. Then he said, may you be blessed of Jehovah, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than your first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And now it is true that I am a Goel. However, there is a Goel nearer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as Jehovah lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another, and he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, give me the cloak that is on you, and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. And then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave me, for he said, do not go empty-handed. Then she said, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Goel of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here, and they sat down. Then he said to the Goel, Naomi, who has come back from the fields of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who were sitting here today and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me, that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." And the Goel said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the Goel said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal.
And I thought it was interesting that they remove a sandal to confirm a matter, and that Moses and Joshua are told to remove their sandals when they're approaching holy ground. And remember that theme of approaching the throne, which is holy ground, and that approaching the presence, and that idea of confirming a covenant overlapping with that sandal.
Anyone else? Okay. So then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Machlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Machlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the dead on his inheritance." There's some resurrection language for you.
Mm-hmm.
"So that the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers or from the gate of his place. You are witnesses today."
And that reminded me of, you know how he said there's someone nearer to you, and they got the option first to redeem the land and her, and then the guy said, "I cannot do it." I don't think, I think layered on top of that might just be, that he needed to raise up his own family. He didn't want to do that for someone else's, but I don't think he could do that in the greater theme of the story. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "It is written, the first Adam became a living being, the last Adam a life-giving spirit." So your first Adam, your closer relative, is not able to redeem you. The second is the life-giving spirit. The first Goel, the nearer relative, said, "I cannot redeem it," and that was true. He couldn't raise up the dead like this Redeemer was going to do, raise up the name of the dead.
Very nice. Okay, and all the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which Yahweh shall give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and Yahweh enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed is Yahweh, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. And the neighborhood women, gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed, and he is the father of Yeshai, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Abinadab, and to Abinadab was born Nachshon, and to Nachshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Yeshai, and to Yeshai David.
I wanted to spend just a minute and talk about the Perez piece, because he's mentioned twice here at the end. And there is an hour presentation by Rabbi David Foreman on Aleph Beta about Shavuot. There's several different ones, but this particular one put 3 stories side by side: the book of Ruth, the story of Judah and Tamar, and the story of Lot and his daughter. And I wanted to just pull out a couple things about what he said. It was very good. If you have a subscription to that, I would recommend watching that. But I wanted to kind of explain how these stories relate to each other, why they would start this lineage at the end with Perez, and why the people of the town would say that in reference to Perez. So, okay, you have the book of Ruth. Now let's look, just consider the story of Judah and Tamar, because there's some similar elements here. In the book of Ruth, Naomi's two sons have died. And now what we have is Ruth's kinsman, Boaz, comes in to continue the family name. In the story about Judah and Tamar, what you had was Judah's two sons die, and Tamar has to use seduction, which you could argue Ruth did a little too when she uncovered him, to get Judah to trick him into continuing the family name. So you have that going on with both stories, and that Judah, or the son that was born, well, there were two sons, but one of the sons that was born as a result of the Judah-Tamar incident was Perez. That guy. Or did you switch the slide? Oh, back up. Was Perez. And so Boaz is the seventh son of that Judah-Tamar incident. So there's that one. Hold on. You also have something kind of similar with Lot and his daughters after the destruction of Sodom, because you had, I don't know if the daughters thought it was the end of the world and they were the last three people on earth. They might have thought that. I think Lot knew better. So in order, and it says to continue the family name, their father drunk, Boaz's heart was merry, and that's how the line was continued. And the connection there, not just that idea of continuing the family line and how it was accomplished, but also that the Moabites were the result of Lot, his daughters. And so Ruth, this Moabitess, it's from the line that happened in that story. So when you take these, hold on just a second. I wanted to pull out just one thing that he pulled out from those three stories about kindness, because the story of Lot and the Sodom and Gomorrah thing happens right after Abraham shows that hospitality. And then you have, right after that, Lot, he does kind of the same thing, showing hospitality, taking the angels in, and they weren't supposed to do that. To offer bread and water to a stranger in Sodom and Gomorrah, I read it was a capital offense. You did not do that. They had all this weird stuff they would do to strangers. They were really not kind to strangers at all. And so Lot was in trouble. And in the Christian camp, we focus on that one aspect of Sodom and Gomorrah, the one, and we miss that if you look at in Judaism, the broader problems that were there had to do with that hospitality and that cruelty to strangers and the lack of justice piece. And so that cruelty to strangers thing, or kindness to strangers, I kind of wanted you to keep in mind. And when Lot did his kindness, it was to the strangers, right? Just like Abraham saw the strangers and ran out even though he was circumcised and fed them. Lot did the same thing. He saw the guys in the square and pulled them in. So he also showed kindness to strangers. But if you watch the Aleph Beta video, it was a broken kindness, because at the same time he's showing kindness to strangers, look what he did to his daughters. He was charged with their protection, and he offered them to the crowd in place of the strangers. And so, and that goes back to that idea that we bring up every once in a while about tripping over the people right in front of you because you're trying to go out and help the world. Like worrying about the starving children in Africa and forgetting to feed your kids lunch kind of idea. And because the other one makes you feel more righteous. But that really, you got to take care of what's close to you before you start moving out and taking care of things that are more distant. So, Now, the Moabites, the people that are descended from Lot and his daughters, do you remember what was said of them? There was 2 incidents with them in the wilderness and Israel. Do you remember what they did? Because they didn't give you bread and water. So here you have this entire people group now that won't give the bread and the water, that won't show hospitality. And then the other thing they did was the Baal Peor incident. So when you get to the story about Judah and Tamar, Judah was unkind. I don't know how he was to strangers, but he was unkind to his own family members. Remember, he's the one that arranged to have Joseph sold, and he withheld his 3rd son from his daughter-in-law, and thereby cutting off the name of his first son that she was married to that died. And so he was ready to put her to death until he realized the role he had played in it. So consider Boaz and the way he demonstrated his kindness, because while being very generous with Ruth, the stranger, he did wait. He kind of withheld his kinsman redeemer role until she pressed the issue. And I don't know. Did any one of you want to comment on that? And then I wanted to just briefly touch on the placement of all those stories. Yes, Keith.
Yeah, back on the Ruth, when she was going out into the fields to glean, and normally that was left to the corners. You're supposed to stay in the corners, right? Those reapers were given orders from their Lord to go ahead from the good sheaths to start hand picking, pulling weed out and leaving it laying on the ground behind them so she could find it and pick it up. Which I thought, that's pretty unique, because they were hand picking stuff under Boaz's recommendation, or he said, go ahead and do this for her.
And does that make you think of a verse? And it's in Joel chapter 2, the one that he was just reading from, with the day of gloom and thick darkness and the army of locusts. Right in the middle of that, it speaks about Yahavah's compassion. It says, who knows, he may turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain and a drink offering for the Lord your God. That's like crumbs from the master's table right there for the poor and the stranger. And that woman who made that comment about even the dogs eat crumbs from your table, she knew who she was, just like Ruth knew. I'm different from your maidservants, she said. And she knew she was the stranger and the poor, and who inherits the kingdom? The poor,
right?
In spirit.
Because all the poor of Israel would have been out through all those fields gleaning corners, trying to get their bread.
Also, I think there's a connection too to like how she went with Naomi to Zechariah. I think it's an 11. I want to say, no, maybe it's not 11. That there's a scripture that says, "Let us go with you," like when the basically Gentiles are
grab hold.
Yeah, grab hold of
yeah.
the Zephaniah, I think, of the hem of a Jew and say, "Let us go with you, for we know God is with you."
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about Zechariah 11 because Naomi's name means beauty or delight, and there's a connection to Judah with that same name that I can't get into now because I'd have to look it up. But so I just think there might be a connection there to like the Gentile taking a hold of the Jew and going with them because they know God is with them. And also a neat word picture or whatever with Moab. The land of Moab means of the father, of his father, of her father, whatever. So it says that she came out of the fields of her father, which is like the field is the world. So it's just like the
That's what I
daughter,
thought.
leaving. There's a psalm that says every daughter that does not leave her father's house, like we're supposed to leave the land of our fathers, just like Abraham, just like Rebecca, and then come out and not go back there to the land that he is calling us toward. Yeah.
Yeah, and during that 50 days, one of the things they did was, let's go back to Egypt. Oops. So, now Now, the timing of those two stories, that story of Judah and Tamar and that story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, they're like these little interruption blips in Genesis. In Genesis, you have this big story about Abraham, and then you've got a real big story about Joseph. And during the story about Abraham, you have this Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his daughters incident. And then you resume the story of Abraham. And in the story of Joseph, you're going along and you get to Genesis chapter 38, and all of a sudden you're back and talking about Judah and Tamar, and then you go back to Joseph in Egypt, and that story continues. And so both of these stories are kind of interruptions. And what's interesting is that Leviticus 23 thing, he pointed out that you're going along and getting the instructions for the Moedim and how to do them and when to do them, and there's this interruption. Don't glean to the corners of your field, which is where you found Ruth gleaning, where the Redeemer found Ruth gleaning. So I just wanted to, I heard a saying once that said something to the effect of, because I hate being interrupted. I'm really bad at being interrupted. Alan's really good at it because I interrupt him all day long and he's really patient with me about it. But that interruptions are not getting in the way. I'll say, you're sabotaging my mission if you interrupt me, because it takes me so long to get back on track. And I have to remember this saying, that interruptions are not getting in the way of your life. Interruptions are where life is happening. And it's in those stories of Lot and his daughters where life was happening, because you have the ancestors of Messiah, the story about that. It's in that interruption of Judah and Tamar, because those are the ancestors of Messiah that are coming together in this story of Ruth. And it's in those instructions of the Moedim where you have life in the corners of your field that you're not gleaning and that you're giving to the stranger and the poor.
Another Shavuot like interruption thing that he says, and you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. So that's also attached to a Shavuot command to keep the feast day.
Yeah.
So it ties right into this whole picture that we're talking about too.
So I have a question, and it's something I've wondered about for a long time. What is the custom of a woman laying herself at this man's feet? What is the meaning of that from the culture? Because it's repeated in the New Covenant a lot with, Mary at his feet and the woman with the perfume at his feet.
I know.
So
I hadn't looked into the cultural. I just thought foot of the mountain. It's where they were supposed to stay at the foot of the mountain, and that whole idea of when you approach the throne, you're humble. You are the penitent man who's bowed like the wheat that has its fruit heavy and bending its head down, so that when the harvest happens, right, not to be destroyed. And so when I saw feet, I was like, humble, the place where you're humble, the place, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other observations, Mike?
And I'm not sure how it relates to your question, but I noticed that she asked that his skirt be spread, and that's word is the same word for corner or wing where the seats hang. So I don't know if there's some relation there to what Tracy was saying, grabbing onto the.
Because that's on the wing.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Definitely seems connected to me. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I think is that you feel good? Okay. Well, that is our little Shavuot discussion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to count. Now that Shavuot has fully arrived, I'm going to count the final head of grain. And we say, blessed are you of our God, the King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and has commanded us to count the Omer as we approach Shavuot.
As we arrive at Shavuot.
As we arrive at Shavuot. That is the final of 50 stalks of grain. We have arrived at the 50th day. It is now Shavuot. Baruch Hashem. I thank you guys. We will be meeting again next Friday evening.